Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Sanderson, and I'm co-founder of the Future Laboratory. What is the Future Laboratory, you're asking? Well, for those of you that haven't heard me speak already today, the Future Laboratory is a trends, brands, and consumer insight consultancy. We collaborate with our clients to really help them unlock the potential, the current and future potential of their business by doing some very simple things. And the first of those is to help them to get into the minds of their consumers. For us, our guiding philosophy as a business is to think and act with the mind of the consumer. In everything we do, we try and put the consumer at the center of our research and our thinking, because we really truly believe it is the consumer that drives society and technology forward, not the other way around. We are not driven, we are the driving force. We change and shape the world around us, and technology helps that process, as does industry. And that, I think, is really central to what we do. And via LSN Global, which is our online trends portal, we cover over 14 different lifestyle categories. So we don't just focus on design or architecture or interiors. We look at retail, we look at luxury, we look at automotive, we look at finance, we look at digital, and it goes on and on and on and on. And we believe that that gives us a really unique vision, I think, of both the consumer landscape now, but also how it's changing. And that's the critical bit, because it's all about being able to see into the future and being able to understand how our consumer is changing. And doing that isn't magic. It's not something that you do by crossing your legs and sort of trying to levitate and hoping that you're going to get in touch with the inner consumer you. It's far more actually about being able to understand that the future has already happened. It's just that it isn't very well distributed. I wish I could lay claim to that very wise piece of information, but in fact that insight came from the American writer and thinker William Gibson. But he's absolutely right that already we see the future happening around us. We see it in pockets, maybe of a town. We see it within particular people in a society, people who are always just ahead. Because according to research that's been done and validated over the last 30 years, it's less than 5% of any given society or population who are actual innovators within a community. And in fact, there are only sort of 13.5% of us who are what are classified as being early adopters. So the numbers of us that really are embracing change early are very, very small. The majority of us come to change quite late. Which is why we tend to speak in terms of early majority and late majority, groups of people who understand change and embrace it once everyone is doing it as well. And that's how we talk about tipping points and the point at which everyone seems to suddenly be wearing a particular type of shoe, buying a particular type of bag, listening to the same music, or indeed enjoying the same type of tastes in their kitchen or their bathrooms or their homes and their interiors. So plotting and charting this process of change and adaptation is what we do. And by doing that, we can actually help to understand what is likely to happen in the future and therefore share that information with our clients so that they really do understand it ahead of trend. And that's really what we're all about at LSN Global. Oh, thank you, Katie. Perfect. So our online portal, LSN Global, is an online subscription site. And we're here at 100% Design. We've got a stand over there. So do come and visit us after the presentation, and we can tell you a little bit more about what we do and share that information with you. So anyway, let's get on with the topic of this presentation, where I'm really going to look at an idea that we've started to formulate over the last 5 years called the Bleisure Hive. Now, Bleisure is a word that we've created, and you can probably guess where it comes from. It comes from business and leisure. But I was very interested the other day because I actually Googled Bleisure, and there are now over 25 pages on Google about the idea of Bleisure. So clearly it's taken on, and I think it has, because it really touched a nerve when we came up with the word of understanding the shift that we're seeing in the way that people are thinking. And to demonstrate that, I've got a quote here from Martin Lindström, who's a Swedish brand futurist. "We are no longer simply business people at work and private people at home. People are checking personal emails at work and work emails at home. The lines between work and play are merging on all levels." And it's this blurring of business and leisure that I think is creating what has been termed a Bleisure revolution. this shift in the way that we behave, the change in the way that we think about structuring our daily lives. Now, all sorts of reasons or things have precipitated this. I mean, the mobile phone being one of them. In the UK alone, only over £5 billion, it is estimated, is created by you actually deciding to work in downtime. You're sending off an email while you're waiting for a bus or sitting on a train, or even at the traffic lights in your car, that at 6 in the morning, as soon as you wake up, you actually decide to sign off on a project or click the go button on something. And that idea that actually you're spending time that within, just 10 years ago would never have been regarded as work time. It was nothing time. You were waiting for a bus. You were just getting out of bed. You were cleaning your teeth. You were waiting for the lights to change. You are now actively making money. You are generating income for you or for your business in this downtime. You are blurring the lines between work and play, leisure and professional activity. A perfect example is how many of us now feel it's perfectly acceptable to answer emails while we're by the pool on our summer holiday. And in fact, we believe that the only reason we can get to be by the pool is by the fact that we still continue to answer our emails. Now, this isn't always a good thing. I mean, I kind of think it's come to a pretty sad state of affairs when the last thing you touch at night and the first thing you touch in the morning is a BlackBerry. I mean, there are better things to touch in bed, but, that's the way many of us now live our lives, that, they are defined by the parameters of our professional life. So these boundaries are blurring. And this picture, I think, is another really good example of this. This is from Brazil. And, here you go. This is the picture. That's an office. Okay, so it's for a creative business, but that's an office. And increasingly, more and more offices look like this. And not just because they're trying to be funky, but because the people who actually work in these spaces define their lives in these ways and therefore work like this. So this sense of the seamlessness between work and play is part of what we're defining or calling our Bleisure revolution. So we talk in terms of Bleisurites, actual groups of workers who are adopting lifestyles that are often super connected, highly digital, highly engaged, highly socially networked, often always on. There is no off button. I am always on. And in fact, when you talk to a younger generation, which is primarily what the Bleisure generation is, this idea, for example, of the fact that you can't access anyone by email or phone on an airline is for many of us from an older generation a great thing. It's the one time that we don't, have to answer emails. But for a younger generation, they'd rather you didn't give them air on the plane. So that sense of difference is what we also see with the Bleisure generation. Friction-free. This idea of what's now being termed frictionless sharing, that increasingly the way that we transmit data online, we do it without even noticing. So, for example, many of you, if you click onto an app, will find that you've agreed for that app to be combing through all of your social network sites to enable that app to learn more about you. And you're doing that because you're really happy about sharing your data because you can see the positive benefit. Those of us from a slightly older generation often find this slightly scary because we don't often understand exactly what's going on, but mainly because we don't get the benefit. We don't understand the benefits that apps or modern technology deliver that make our lives more frictionless and how that actually gives or lends itself to a social improvement. Convergence, again, a hot word over the last decade. This idea of increasingly our devices, our technology, all converge. Our lifestyles converge as we start to, again, see a seamless move from one to the other, and flexibility, that we actually desire and yearn for flexibility. So what are some of the drivers that are causing these shifts? Well, underpinning this idea, I think, of a Bleisure lifestyle is really this continued desire, as I've said, to be always on, this more millennial mindset. So again, we're all aware of this idea of the shift that we've seen with a generation of people who, really have been part of the digital revolution that's taken place over the last 20 years. Many of us, have grown up with this rather than having to learn to live with it as part of our work routine. I came into work when You didn't actually have computers in the office space, believe it or not. We had a word processor, and we had just one of them. And we had a fax machine. We had a fax machine until recently. We got rid of it because one of our interns got very excited when they saw this piece of paper coming out of the end, and we told them it was a fax from a client in Brazil, and they believed that this was an actual piece of paper that the client from Brazil had put into a machine in Brazil, and it had been transported all the way to the UK, and it was the actual piece of paper. Which kind of, it tells you a lot about interns, but also tells you a lot about what we expect modern technology to deliver. So the millennial mindset, I think, is increasingly important to remember, that we have to start down-aging a lot of our thinking, because the process of change is now so rapid that it is becoming tough for a lot of us to keep up. We're also part of a multitask generation. One of the other things we looked at recently from a social perspective was the growth of what's been called the // generation. No one's content to do just one job anymore. You've got to be a designer / broadcaster / journalist / DJ / chef or something. So this idea that, we now see generations of people who are not confined by our understanding or a traditional understanding of a job for life or a traditional vocation. It's also shifting the way that we demand space and the way that we demand space to work for us. Whole brain thinking, a lot of work. Daniel Pink, the writer, has done a lot looking at this idea of, whole brain thinking. Many of us have grown up again through a period where, we would sort of staunchly say, oh, well, we're creative, so this is great. We think in a certain way, and then you've got all these other people who use their brain in a very different way, and they're business-minded, and, they're very lateral and process-driven and organized, but I'm not, I'm a creative, so... And increasingly, people are going, well, wouldn't it make sense to use both sides of my brain to actually be, lateral and intuitive, to put the two together? So whole brain thinking, again, as a business premise, is, again, gaining ground. And that sense of how we start to design spaces that work for our multifunctional, multitasking lives is what we're increasingly seeing. So if we are always on all of the time, and always on has combined with a share-it-all culture, that increasingly, if you think about it, what defines you in the digital era is which side of the digital divide you sit on or you are on. And forgive me if you were in the audience this morning. I was talking about this morning. That's how you can understand how you feel about this. There's a very simple way to understand which side of the digital divide you're on. If you think that the internet really is just a glorified yellow pages, in other words, you just take stuff from it, it's a source of information, and you take from the internet, you're on one side of the digital divide. If you think that the internet is actually a platform for collaboration and for sharing and for engagement and for connection and creating, you're on the other side of the digital divide. Now, guess which is the good side to be on? Well, it is, of course, where you see it as a platform, and it's a multi-functioning platform for sharing, for connection, for collaboration. But of course, that means that you have to be prepared to share and to engage. So your sense of all those issues that surround data or privacy are very different from somebody who simply uses the internet to take and isn't necessarily putting anything back up in its place. Now, whilst no one is ever that simplistic, we all sit somewhere in between often, I think you get the point, which is that there's a major driving force coming up behind the early development of the web, which is all about collaboration and connectivity. Just some stats here. 81% of UK smartphone owners have their device switched on all the time. It's never off. There is no off button. That affects the way you think about your life. There is no off button. I'm always on. 80% of Europeans use smartphones and tablets to work online in the living room while participating in family activities. Yes, I'm looking after my kids, but I'm also solving a problem. By 2014, we will access the internet more through mobile devices than through traditional laptops or PCs. So our primary engagement with the internet will be through the mobile phone. So it's wherever we go, whenever we go. And that's a mindset shift. It's a massive mindset shift because it changes the way that we behave. So if we look for a moment at our study group, our tribe, if you like, the ones that we can examine in a kind of anthropological way, we have to think about the millennial mindset. So let's put ourselves in the place of the millennial and try and get under their skin a bit. They're going to be born between about 1982 and 1990. That's scary for some of us in this room. The millennials that we looked at are highly creative, they're very collaborative and often very entrepreneurial. Again, it's a shift that we see in the way that they behave. Very tech savvy, with gadgets almost becoming an extension of their bodies. They multitask, talk, walk, listen, type, and text, and their priorities are simple. They come first. So this sense of understanding, and this is through the words of one of them themselves, a correspondent for 60 Minutes from CBS that we spoke to, I think we begin to get this sense of a multitasking generation that can switch between mediums. Millennials switch between multiple devices and media platforms over 27 times an hour, it is estimated. So you're also multi-screening and multi-functioning. That, you know, it's never about just one single activity. Don't try and get a millennial to unitask. They can't do it. 90% of multi-screeners switch mediums to accomplish a goal. You move from one thing to the next, and you cross them in ways that, again, many of us find quite difficult because it goes against our thinking or norms of business practice. How we use space begins to change because so much of this generation is about working for oneself or doing your own thing in your own time. So the requirements of space within the traditional home start to change. And we've been doing a lot of work on this because, again, if you start to think about the changes we're seeing in the home, if you're talking about a bleisure lifestyle, blurring the lines between business and leisure, you're probably going to be co-opting or opting yourself in for a job that allows you to work at your own time and often in your own space. Well, imagine if there are 3 or 4 of you because you share a household all doing this. The shift that we're going to see in the next decade is going to really dynamically change the need within a household for space. Because many of us are now lucky enough to be able to work from home, but often we only have one home worker at the home at one given point in time. What happens if there are 3 or 4 of them from, say, 3 different generations? You've got an 18-year-old, a 45-year-old, and a 65-year-old who all want to be able to work from home at the same time, demanding privacy, security, and space. That puts a lot of stress on a traditional family home. So that idea of how we have to rethink space and rethink how we work and how we use space becomes, I think, hugely important. Now, I mentioned earlier this idea of whole brain thinking. And increasingly, this is the kind of talk that we're beginning to see, this idea that it's about firing up the whole brain, merging the left brain, which is traditionally about, kind of very process-driven, lateral thinking, work-driven, with play and creativity, which is a right brain activity. But this idea of how you put the two together is something that's been obsessing a lot of people, from Daniel Pink to Henry Mintzberg, who's at McGill University in the US. The excessive focus on analysis, targets, and number crunching, and the absence of introspection and imagination have resulted in a crisis in management that is partly to blame for our own current financial crisis. So it seems almost as if, even within business, we're beginning to understand that the nature of how we do business has to change and become more creative and become more whole-brained in its approach, which is why we start to see all sorts of offices rethink the types of space that we expect people to work and function in. And this idea of creating spaces that encourage and facilitate conversation, for example, facilitate thinking, and just engage with the worker and the employee in a very different way becomes more and more important. So the impacts that we start to define in the decade to come, I think, become quite clear. The first is what we've called the flexthetic space. We like making up words at the Future Laboratory. As well as, of course, a Bleisure hub or indeed a micro office. So let's kind of look at those in some depth as we start to think about how designers and studios are really rethinking the workspace. The Verbandkammer Flexible Multifunctional Workspace by Nilsen Flugtfelder. So where does that take us? Well, it takes us to a shift in traditional working patterns. And it takes us, I think, often to really beginning as designers to appreciate the divisions between work and leisure and how they're diminishing. how spaces have to become multifunctional to be relevant to the 21st century user, how they have to be more adaptable in their design to fit new purpose, how they actually have to facilitate collaboration and engagement with the user rather than dictating use to the user. Again, putting the consumer in the forefront and really at the center often of the design process. So that sense of rethinking utility, rethinking how we use space, is something that I think we increasingly see. So this, I think, is a good example. This is a film studio called the Emu Film Studio by Studio Swine. They're the designers. Thinking about using fold-out desks, simple pegboard systems, maximizing what is really a very small office, a 10 square meter space. But for many of us, that's more than we may actually have ourselves. And so this idea of often willfully playful suggestions, redefining the idea of what a traditional office space would look like, is part of what the Bleisure trend is all about. Encouraging spaces, or creating encouraging spaces for work and play. Whether it be for small room meets, this is Innica hands for effect, creating, as it were, small units where you can have a private conversation within a larger office maybe, emphasizing a more casual approach that we're seeing to working. And again, I think that casuality is what's redefining the office environment. That change that we require, that way in which we need to be able to focus in different ways, that we are increasingly being encouraged to move away from our desks, to take our hands off our PCs, to give our brains time to think and to have a moment of pause, to actually allow everything that we've been doing to sink through so that the good ideas come through, the strategy develops, and we actually start to see some results from all our hard work. So let's think about some of the consequences that we begin to see from these ideas. There is definitely already happening, and it's gaining ground. This is a small trend, but it's getting bigger and bigger, a new emphasis on the work-life balance. And I think this is also because a generation over 40 strove to develop a work-life balance, and for them often it was a battle. It was a hard-won, achievement that they fought to secure. Whereas when we look at a younger generation of workers in their early 20s, it's almost taken as for granted that work-life balance is what the future of work will all be about. So there's a very different sense as to what work-life balance is all about, I think, for a younger generation. And we'll see that obviously continue over the next decade. And that sense, I think, of how we reward our time spent at work, that we feel good about it rather than simply exhausted, changing again the mentality of the workspace. It's very interesting if you go and look at the business section of any good bookshop. It's where you really begin to get a sense of how work is changing and how our professional climate is changing. And from that, we can start to judge the type of office interiors that businesses will expect in the future. And one of the areas that we've seen a lot of writing about recently has been this idea of sublimity, believe it or not, within the workspace. Both The Economist magazine and the Wall Street Journal have in recent months looked at this idea of creating happiness indexes within the working environment. So increasingly we do see, and companies like Google are often at the forefront of this, we've seen large corporate organizations try to challenge the idea that they are just sort of hives of industry and are not thinking about the welfare or the wellness of their employees. And increasingly, they're also beginning to understand that when so many of us now are just what is now classified as being a knowledge worker. Anyone heard that expression before? Okay, well, I guarantee that most of you are actually knowledge workers. How many of you spend the majority of your day attached to a keyboard? Okay, you're a knowledge worker. Because basically what you're doing is just pushing information digitally around. That's all you do. You might think you're being creative, but let's be honest, you're not really. All you're doing is managing information. And you're a knowledge worker. That's really what we've become. And it's only when we step away from the computer, we give ourselves that moment of pause and reflection, that we often transform ourselves into being creative. I mean, how many times have you had to go to a brainstorm? You know, these awful enforced environments where you're supposed to come up with a great idea in 30 minutes, often in a room with really, really garish furniture, or even worse, with bean bags. It just doesn't happen. You know, as we all know, those moments of insight often will come a week or maybe 2 weeks or a month after that meeting to discuss the parameters of a project. And it's actually when you're walking the dog or you're in the shower or you're sitting on the loo that the moment of insight or the good idea comes to you. You know, so I always think you should have a whiteboard in the shower. That's the best place to have a whiteboard, or to have the marker pens to just quickly mark it down on the tiles in your bathroom. But you know, increasingly larger organizations are actually thinking, yeah, we do need space to think. We do need space to relax. So this is a project done here by Ericsson Skjaja Architects. Called The Monastery, and it was about, I think this was for Bloomberg actually, about creating a space that was like a chapel, you know, a secular chapel within a large organization that offered a moment of respite, somewhere where you could go in and you could sit down and you could think about what you needed to think about to be better at your job. People want a real and authentic life. This is Alan Moore, who's the author of No Straight Lines, Making Sense of Our Non-Linear World. They understand that their world is richer, and that needs to be nurtured through a spiritual connection to the world. So here we are, even though we're talking about business, we're talking about a spiritual connection. And I think that's hugely important, and it is something that we begin to see more and more of. I'm sure many of you remember this, the fantastic installation by the Buriat brothers last year at the London Design Festival in the V&A space, which I think was a perfect example of how suddenly you can transform a space in a very simple way by interrupting in a counterintuitive way the natural flow, or the prescribed flow really, of what is supposed to happen in that space. Yes, of course, it's a gallery. It's supposed to be about reflection and observation, but you're supposed to do it in a very, you know, very organized, prescribed way. You're supposed to stand there and look at this art in awe. And suddenly they, of course, created this wonderful, huge sort of sofa where people could loll and lounge and reflect in some, I think, really quite interesting and stimulating ways. And that sense of creating time-out zones, of places that allow you to rethink in a different way, is really beginning to catch on in business. So the idea of the pod, or the small space, where you can actually just lock yourself in and just let go, becomes hugely important. As I said earlier, this idea of being a knowledge worker, 50% of a knowledge worker's day is purely spent just managing information. And according to BaseX, which is a US-based business, this results in a loss of ability to make decisions, process information, and prioritize tasks. In other words, the very tasks that we've set ourselves to complete are the very ones that are stopping us from doing what lies at the heart of our jobs, or should actually be what makes us creative, and therefore what makes us profitable for either ourselves or the companies that employ us. So we believe that in the future, bleisure lifestyles will actually become the norm. I mean, for many of us, they already are becoming the norm, as work and play become indistinguishable. As actually what drives us forward in life is a happy marriage between the two. Our interiors will increasingly be adaptable and hackable to fit ever-changing uses and purposes, that we expect our offices and the spaces that we use to really change and merge as we change and merge, to be able to move as we move. So we now talk about the modified or the hacked home. Taking this word hacking, which is being used for programming, and is used, you know, to define this idea of hacking into a program, changing something that's been defined. And this idea that increasingly as consumers, we want to hack into the pre-designed world and say, no, sorry, you may have designed it that way, but I'm going to use it this way, or I need it to behave this way for me. And that, again, I think is critical, that people will modify, hack, and of course, more and more, download customized plans and formations to create customized interiors to suit the needs of their multi-generational households. And that idea, I think, of allowing for that and encouraging that is really going to be the way forward. So this project, again, really caught our eye. This is by Timo Hildebrandt. And what this designer did was transform a space under the stairs into a partitioned room. And in his latest project, The Ascending Retreat, he's really looked at how you use that space, creating a multifunctional level that could be used for sleeping, for sitting, or for relaxing with a laptop. And that sense of rethinking space is going to be one of the primary requirements of interior design in the decade to come. Clearly, obviously, it's always been a focus for many of us, but the desire for space and to get maximum yield from space will be hugely important as we move into the next decade. So this is why the word modular has come back into fashion again, back into vogue, that we start to see, again, the return to modular furniture, something that we've seen at various points over the 20th century, but we're enjoying a return, I think, to the role of modular furniture, whether it be Mima, creating this particular house with movable screens and panels and mats that enabled the family who live there to really shape it according to need, and that idea that need can actually change often quite quickly, to Ralph Sachs working with flexible desk and shelving designs that again allow you to be modular and to structure things the way that you want them to be. So in the Bleisure Hive, living rooms have become conference rooms. Kitchens serve as HQs, and dining tables may need to actually accommodate a global board meeting. And that sense, I think, is beginning to redefine our sense of what home can mean. Again, from Daniel Pink, we often thought of work as something you do to earn money to buy leisure. Work will become a profitable hobby rather than a drudgery. And just again, that slightly counterintuitive way of thinking about the world of work and what it is that so many of us spend so much of our time doing and putting so much of our energy into, I think is really important. That focus, that shift of focus, as we start to even talk about the idea of a post-employment economy, that work lives will change drastically as technology disrupts a myriad of industries. So in the way that we've experienced over the last 20 years, a digital revolution, the impact of which most of us are still really not aware of as it happens around us. We're still very much in the eye of the storm of a digital revolution. We're only really beginning to wake up to the second industrial revolution as our manufacturing really begins to change in some very profound and dramatic ways as we reassess logistics and the logistical processes that we took for granted in the 20th century that really are now no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. So, as connectivity improves, offices to some extent may just become relics of a pre-internet age. So we've already looked at this idea of how many people who traditionally currently commute to an office within 10 years will simply not have to do this. Because that 2 hours time that is spent commuting there and back every day will be seen as a complete waste of time. I cannot afford to drive for 40 minutes to work because I cannot afford the petrol to put in my car. And I can't walk that far, so I'm going to have to either change my job or be able to structure my work around my home environment. And these are the types of shifts that we'll see. We'll see the emergence of office hubs, that offices will no longer be located in one particular area that we all have to travel to, but a large organization will have many, many hubs across a country where people will go to work. And there could be 20, 50, 150 organizations all using one hub where maybe 3 or 4 employees from one company are hubbed together, but actually sit across a corridor from a totally different company. And that idea of rethinking the pattern of work is part of what the Bleisure revolution is all about. And if we start to throw into this mix the growth of design-it-yourself production, of collaborative production online, created, of course, and spurred on by the growth of 3D printing, of rapid printing, we really start to see different ways that manufacturing changes, and the way that we relate to manufacturing in the home, of course, changes. Many of you will be aware that at CES this year, the first domestic 3D printers went on sale for less than $1,500. So the impact of these is really quite enormous. You know, 10 years ago, a printer was a bloke from Romford. And now a printer is something that sits on your dining table and your kids use it to do their homework. You know, how many people here do not own a home printer? Does it? 2, 3, 4, okay? All right, 5 or 6. You're still in the minority. You get the point. So how long before we all have a 3D printer that's printing stuff for us? And not like just toys or gizmos, things that we really need, like, you know, the fridge door when it breaks. Or, you know, a widget that is missing from, you know, a device, something that you actually require that normally you would have had to either throw that product away or you would have had to send off to Italy to get a replacement part. So increasingly, this shift in terms of a global network of individual workers replacing centralized industries is the critical shift that we begin to see. And so this change, I think, in terms of, can you take the sound out on this? It's really horrid. Thanks. This change in terms of the way that we use the space, it becomes really, really important. And of course, increasingly, the technology allows us to merge in a virtual way with how we use our space also. You know, the changes we're seeing in glass and glass manufacturing, so that glass becomes a space that can be reflective, it can be opaque, it can be translucent, it can carry information, it can do all of these things. You know, so a pane of glass that can act as a TV screen, that can act as a monitor, that can act as a mirror, that can also act as a pair of curtains. This is how we expect to see, you know, connectivity in the future. So, to finish, a few kind of toolkit points, if you like. Use flexible interior design solutions to enable people to shape their homes and offices as they like for their changing needs. So increasingly, if we are involved in office design and office interiors, we really have to listen to those people who are using them every day. And sadly, of course, most of the time we don't. We take a directive from somebody who thinks they know what the employees want, and in fact knows very little about what the future employee wants. So we have to be a lot cannier about ensuring that we're designing for longevity and we're designing for the future office user as well as the office user of today. Can you facilitate frictionless sharing and multi-screening to eliminate technological barriers that limit the Bleisurites? You know, what that means in simple terms is, can you just go with the flow? Can you understand that actually it is about sharing, it's about engagement, and the technology underpins everything that we do? Can you consider an on-off model so users can move between connected and tech-free zones? Because interestingly, despite what I've said about always on, we also see the growth with millennials of their ability to just move from things being on or off, of being able to ignore the phone that rings or ignoring the emails that actually don't need answering. But we're also seeing solutions in terms of creating hubs or areas where there is no signal, where there is no connectivity. So that's also often an answer. Can we acknowledge the desire for holistic rewards with sublime spaces for work and play? Can we bring sublimity and wonder back into the workspace? You know, places where we do allow ourselves to think, to relax, and to let go. Can we create a Bleisure hive with locations for spontaneous interaction and productive focus that can respond to the need for quiet, collaboration, relaxation, and spontaneity? It's, you know, for a lot of offices, this is a tall ask. It's, you know, it's something that we don't even think of, and yet increasingly we are seeing businesses that are responding this way and are understanding the benefits that not just the employees get, but also that the business gets, that the business profits from, by rethinking how we actually productively use our time within the office environment. So can we embrace the prospect of post-employment economy by positively engaging with the DIY revolution through consumer collaboration? Again, you know, for many of us, the idea of the 20th century construct of a 9-to-5 job has already disappeared. So how much longer do we have or need a 9-to-5 office? When it becomes increasingly costly to house an employee, for how much longer will many of us as business owners or large corporates actually think we have to provide a desk for every single one of our employees and all of the costs that go with it? So we'll move into a post-employment economy where we really think very differently about what it means to be part of the professional world.